All right, well, let's perhaps go around the screen and introduce ourselves, and as others join the call, we'll just attend to that, but it is 3 after the hour. So I'm Stephanie Perdew, one of your associate conference ministers, and teaching today, really in my capacity as a tribal citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, one of the few ordained Native folks in the UCC. So Peg, you're at the top of my screen, Hollywood Square style. So would you introduce yourself briefly?
Hi, I'm Peg, a part of this wonderful Illinois conference as a supply pastor and training for interim ministry work. We live in Island Lake.
Which we need, and we're thrilled. Thank you. Cindy. You're muted, Cindy. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Cindy Ball. I'm the lay leader for our Racial Justice Committee at St. Paul's UCC in Chicago.
Wonderful. Thank you. Wayne.
Hi, I'm Wayne McPherson. I'm interim pastor at Epiphany United Church of Christ in Chicago.
Beautiful. Mark.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Winters, pastor at First Congregational UCC in Naperville.
Beautiful. Thank you. James.
Yes, Jim Powers, retired UCC pastor, currently attending at Spring Creek United Church of Christ in Rockford, Illinois.
Wonderful. Thank you. Benna, Pastor Benna Bell.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Benna Bell. Soon to be the transitional pastor for Galewood United Church of Christ.
Amen. Dwayne.
Good afternoon. I'm Dwayne Lottie, currently a member in discernment, pending my ecclesiastical council. So good to be with you this morning, this afternoon.
Hallelujah. Wonderful. That's great news. Harriet. Harriet put an introduction in the chat.
Right.
Thank you.
I was the legacy pastor that closed the Congregational Church in Deerfield, and I show up at a variety of different churches and chair the Justice and Witness for the Chicago Metro Association.
David. Sheridan. Or you're muted, David.
Hello again. I'm David Sheridan. I'm pastor at Spring Creek UCC.
Yeah, thank you. Pastor Jackie.
Hey siblings, I'm Jackie Belisle. I pastor Eden United Church of Christ in the Jefferson Park neighborhood of Chicago, which is why I clapped when Benna introduced herself. Welcome to the cluster, or to this new role in the cluster. Happy to be here. I think the first chat, Stephanie.
Is that true? I've seen you in other venues. Okay, very good. We're thrilled about that, Jackie.
I'm ashamed to say it may be my first Wednesday chat.
That's okay. We're glad you're here. Roger Dart.
Hi, everyone. I'm Roger Dart. I am retired member of Trinity United Church of Christ in Deerfield, and I'm currently serving the conference as the disaster coordinator.
Wonderful. And who else is on the screen? Reverend Kathy Laws is on the screen. I won't make you introduce yourself.
Oh, okay.
unless you want to.
I sped to get in the driveway so I could introduce myself. So okay. I'm Kathy Laws.
Beautiful. Thank you. And we have David McCurdy here who says he's joining from the chat. And Pastor Dale. Anyone else who wants to introduce themselves, just unmute and do so.
I'm Pastor Jennifer Amy Dressler at Open Table United Church of Christ in Ottawa, and just got internet service restored about 10 minutes ago, so we'll see if it lasts.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Anyone else wanting to introduce themselves? Okay, as we are doing this series of all conference chats this fall, focusing on justice and witness ministries in the United Church of Christ. So last week we talked about the open and affirming movement. We have talked about other topics around restorative and racial justice, and Pastor Molly Carlson asked me if I would do some teaching intersecting with Indigenous Peoples Day. So I will do that teaching today. I have some of that in the form of a PowerPoint. I'll go through I think I have 5 slides for you. I don't think more than that. And then want to leave ample time for discussion. And so the topic that I wanted to consider with you today is what we really mean when we talk about what we call the doctrine of discovery. Some of you may be conversant with that term. Some of you may not. By the end of the hour, hopefully you will be. The United Church of Christ intersects with the doctrine of discovery because though it was in essence a series of Roman Catholic papal pronouncements, some of the ideology of discovery certainly informed our, particularly on the Congregationalist side of our merger, ideas about settlement of land and acquisition of land on this continent. We also continue as citizens of the United States to intersect with the doctrine of discovery in the legal sphere because the doctrine of discovery and its kind of ideology continues to inform United States federal Indian law as it's adjudicated in the courts, and in this also most recently in a couple Supreme Court cases that I'll mention later in the hour. The General Synod of the United Church of Christ number 29 formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery at that General Synod and created a series of Bible study and other teaching tools that are available through the link that I put in the chat. There is a study guide that you can download and some other witness ministry links to help you learn more if this is a topic that you want to explore in your local church context. So let me share my screen and just do a little teaching, basically definition of terms, along with a little history, just to get us all on the same page. So let me know just with the thumbs up if you can see my screen. I can't see all of you. So if you have a question as we're going through these, please just unmute and ask the question. Feel very free to stop and interrupt at the time when you have your question. That way we can likely, answer it relative to the information that's on the screen. Or you're also more than welcome to hold your question until the end. So just to get a little bit of definition out there, because I think in my newsletter article about this, introducing the topic, I used some terms that may seem kind of interchangeable. They're not necessarily totally interchangeable, but they're terms that you will encounter when you work in the area of doctrine of discovery. And these are my definitions, but they're also based partly on definitions of the United Nations, definitions of the United States Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a subsection of the Department of the Interior. So Indigenous people is really the blanket term the United Nations uses worldwide, and we use worldwide, to talk about people who are culturally distinctive, ethnic and language groups of people, native to a place, anchored in land, living in places that have been colonized, but attempting to maintain their Indigenous culture, language, and life ways. So, for instance, we know that there are Indigenous people all over the world, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Finland, in an infinite variety of places. In the United States, we tend to refer to those Indigenous people as Native or Native American. That's kind of a blanket term often used in the United States. In Canada, First Nations will usually be the term used, and Indigenous communities in Mexico, Central and South America will sometimes be referred to as Native American or will be referred to by their tribal name. The term American Indian, with Indian being, an inaccurate description of where Columbus landed and who he thought he was encountering, the term American Indian is still used by the federal government of the United States. We, as I said, have this section of the Department of the Interior called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but there are also Native movements in the United States that use the term American Indian. The American Indian Movement, which was a Native, essentially civil, tribal, sovereign rights organization that rose up in the 1960s, is a paramount example of this. Here in the Native community in Chicago, the main place of gathering we have is the American Indian Center. So that is not necessarily, for many Native folks, a pejorative term. It's kind of a historic term and sometimes a term that we will use for ourselves. This also is a federal government term, and when used in that capacity, it refers to persons with tribal citizenship or enrollment. Not all people of Native ancestry in the United States have pursued or are eligible to pursue tribal citizenship or enrollment in their tribe. But for those who are, there are 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the continental US, and inclusive of Alaska, where in Alaska alone, there are 231. And we'll talk a little bit more about citizenship and enrollment, but it's safe to say that in this era of federal Indian law, tribal nations are the controllers of who they deem to be a citizen or not a citizen in their native nations. That did not used to be the case. There was a much more paternalistic relationship with the federal government. But as of about the 1980s, with the restoration of a great deal of sovereign autonomy to Native nations control who is admitted to tribal citizenship and under what criteria. And those criteria are not standard. They are the discretion of the tribe. All tribes have a need to show and prove ancestry. Some tribes also use a method that the federal government used to use called blood quantum, which is an attempt truly to measure the amount of your blood that is Native. That is a process avoided by many Native nations because it seems to have a background in eugenics, or as used by the federal government in ages past, was often an attempt to decide when someone was no longer Native, not to decide when they were. So many tribes are moving away from using blood quantum as a way to determine who is a legitimate member of their tribe. We use often the word tribal to refer to people with tribal citizenship. People who are Native will sometimes call themselves Indian. That's a personal preference. There are different Native movements in the United States named Red, people of all red nations, women of all red nations. So depending on who uses that term and in what context, it may or may not be pejorative. And then often we refer to ourselves by the name of our tribal nation. That is really the primary way that we will refer to ourselves. So if you meet someone who's Native, just ask them how they prefer to be referred to. That's always a safe thing to do. There were 15 to 20 million people on the landmass of what we now consider the United States pre-contact. And that's based on a lot of, I think, reliable archaeological and anthropological postulation. We do know that in 1910, there are about 250,000 people in the United States that the federal government was identifying as Native. The total population likely greatly exceeds that. As I mentioned, there was an era in United States federal Indian policy when the United States government was trying to minimize the number of people it counted as Native. So that number is likely higher, but certainly in those, almost 500 years, 400 years, there was a devastating loss of Native population due to disease and due to federal policies of extermination and due to war and conquest. In the 2020 census, that population has rebounded. 9.7 million people identified as American Indian or Alaskan Native, 3.7 million identifying that as their sole identity, 5.9 million, such as myself, identifying that ancestry or that tribal citizenship in combination with some other identity. And the median age right now of Indian country is a term we use to refer to all of the Indian territory and nations around the United States and those really living outside of reservation areas. But the population is younger than the US median population. And I just referenced my own tribe. There are about 390,000 of us tribal citizens, about 150,000 of whom live within our nation's boundaries. We're one of 3 bands of the Cherokee in the United States, and our particular nation was an effective federal Indian removal policy. And so we're located in the top kind of section, northeast section of Oklahoma. And we have about 150,000 tribal citizens living within those boundaries. I don't know that we need to go through this because I think I just talked a little bit about tribal citizenship, how tribal citizenship is determined, but it probably is good to say that tribal citizenship is a political relationship. Native identity or ancestry is in part a claim about one's racial identity. But for Native people in the United States, our identity is not only about race. If we are tribal citizens, it is also about having essentially dual political citizenship in the United States and in our tribal nation, which means we have a political relationship both with our tribal nation, in which we vote and in which we, sometimes are eligible to receive certain services and in which we have certain sovereign rights. And we have a political relationship with the government of the United States. And as I said, tribal citizenship is determined by each tribe itself, and often is based on the ability to trace one's ancestry or kinship relations. It is usually not anymore. There are a couple tribal exceptions to this, determined by blood quantum, even though the Bureau of Indian Affairs still does issue what we call CBID cards, which are certificate of degree of Indian blood. It's a really problematic idea for us. This came from another class I was teaching, and in the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, our citizenship is determined by relationship to someone listed on what we call the Dawes roll, or the final Cherokee census, which took place during the federal allotment period in the late 19th century. And so this is actually in the Cherokee Courthouse Square in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, but you can see there are these bricks for my mom and my relatives. And that's how those are my Dawes roll, relations. That's how my tribal citizenship is traced. Getting more to the doctrine of discovery, which is our topic today. As we know, pre-contact, and by contact, we mean 1492, or on the eastern seaboard with the Pilgrims or the Plymouth colony, possibly later. There were a number of ethnically and linguistically distinct native groups or nations throughout the North American continent. And this is a somewhat accurate map of generally where those groups resided. And many of these groups, particularly in this section of the United States, so this side of the Mississippi, no longer live or hold land. Some do, some do not. Some were removed westward and resettled as a result of federal Indian removal into other places in the United States. So this is a map now of how the Bureau of Indian Affairs divides its map of tribal land. And some of this is so small that you can't really tell where there are tribal lands. But for instance, in the state of Illinois, there are no land-based tribal nations left in the state of Illinois. They have all been removed through federal Indian policy. Sometimes, often through treaty policy, but through some forced secession of land or through some forced removal. A lot of those removed from other places now reside in the boundaries of what is now the state of Oklahoma. Some of those removed from the state of Illinois now reside in what is now the state of Wisconsin or the state of Michigan. And then in some of these states, you also have land-based tribes that are on some portion of their original homeland, but a vastly eroded portion of that original homeland, right? So a good example would be in South Dakota, the Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations, Ogallala, Lakota. This is a portion of the landmass they used to hold as tribal people, and it does not include the most fertile or resource-rich or sacred, frankly, parts of the land. The Black Hills are outside of this reservation land base. The place where the Mount Rushmore Monument was constructed, which is considered sacred ceremonial land for the Rosebud and Pine Ridge, is outside of the landmass of their reservation. So we have Native populations concentrated now in the United States in very small kind of acreage of landmass. And we have Native population throughout the United States who are not living on their tribal reservations. For instance, I don't live on my tribal reservation in northeastern Oklahoma, which also means that we have urban or suburban areas with a mixed population of Native people. The Chicago area is home to a very diverse Native population at this point. And some of those Native populations in urban areas such as San Francisco, Seattle, Minneapolis, Chicago, some of those Native populations started in those urban areas as a consequence of what we call federal relocation policy, which was a policy in the 1950s and 1960s, which sought to break up kind of Indian relationship with land and relocate Indian people to urban areas and assimilate them into American culture that way. Harriet.
Yes, looking at the map, are there no Native Americans in the eastern section?
There are very few reservations.
Oh, tribal lands, is that?
Tribal lands.
What's the correct term? Tribal lands? Reservations?
Well, some reservations, tribal land is the blanket term. Some tribal land is considered a reservation. Some of it is considered a reserve or a holding. So they're both correct depending on the land mass you're talking about. So if you say tribal lands, that's probably a safe thing. And there are some very tiny little reservation areas like in upstate New York and in Maine. for the most part, and like there's one very small band, Cherokee band, that lives here in the Smoky Mountains of Western North Carolina. That's kind of like the remnant of Cherokees who were able to resist removal over here to Oklahoma. Well, what is now Oklahoma, what was in Indian Territory. But for the most part, a lot of the eastern United States was cleared as a matter of federal policy informed by the Doctrine of Discovery of any significant land-based tribal population.
And when did you say they were moved to, encouraged or moved
It
to
depends
urban
on the,
areas?
yeah, it depends on the tribe, but the Federal Indian Removal Act was 1832, I believe. And that was the government ruling, and it was contested. It was contested by the Cherokee Nation in the Supreme Court, but ultimately it was upheld. It was kind of the brainchild of Andrew Jackson, although it wasn't just his idea. It was informed then already by decades, a century of Indian policy. But the Federal Indian Removal Act was the impetus for a lot of this relocation.
Right.
Of
I thought you'd said in the 60s or 70s something.
No, that
moved
was
back to this urban
the
area.
Removal Act was in the 1830s. The Relocation Act was in the 1950s. So that was the urban Indian relocation, and that was more of an incentive program. Obviously, it was not a military program like it was in the 1830s. It was an incentive-based program where Native communities were promised kind of a certain amount of social welfare and funding for relocation as a way. I mean, the goal was assimilation. The goal was to move people, frankly, off their tribal lands, to kind of break down the reservation system. And of course, when a lot of Native communities arrived in those urban areas, a lot of that infrastructure for their well-being in those areas was not, in fact, in place. But nonetheless, those urban areas still have a big Native population.
Stephanie.
Yeah.
This is Bennett. Can you, my hometown is like 10 minutes away from the Seminole Reservation.
Okay.
Is
Down
that
here
considered a in
Yeah.
Florida?
Okay.
Florida.
Yep.
Is that a tribal land or is it a reservation type setting?
I don't know what their status is, and we'd have to blow up this map much bigger. It's some kind of land holding.
Okay.
And reservation often is a word that refers to how the land is held and
Okay.
whether within that individuals or families hold what are called separate allotments.
Okay.
And so I don't know for sure how that pertains to the Seminole Nation. So
how does
I think-
governance work for them? Whether it's a tribal or whether it's
Yeah.
how does that governance work in different categories?
Yeah, I'll go back to that map in a minute, or to the slides. This is a confusing area. And
Okay.
and we're still within the realm of the Doctrine of Discovery. I want to assure you of that. There has been an evolution of how tribes are governed in the United States. And it's fair to say that, in the 19th century, there was a lot of focus by the federal government on basically exterminating the Indian population. And Indian removal was, or at least clearing land for settlers and for agriculture and for, mineral extraction. And so for essentially terminating Indian rights to land, which is about what the Doctrine of Discovery is about. So federal policy was very much focused on an erosion of tribal sovereignty and removal or relocation of tribal people. But what's always been complicated in United States Indian policy is that kind of concurrent to some of these developments, the federal government was also making treaties with Indian nations and treating Indian nations as sovereign, sometimes custodial, or sometimes residential sovereign nations within the landmass of the United States. So on the one hand, you had a kind of government to government relationship going on. And then on the other hand, you often had a kind of paternalistic relationship going on where a tribal nation had a limited number of rights, within the landmass of the United States, which is still primarily the relationship today. There was a concerted effort, like when that Dawes role was determined for the Cherokee Nation in 1910, there was a concerted effort in the 1900s into the 1920s to put federal control around nations and their government structures, so that a lot of the governance of Native nations was governed by the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That was a pretty paternalistic, situation where a federal Indian agent would be assigned to each tribal nation to kind of oversee and run their affairs, with the presumption being, which also goes back to the Doctrine of Discovery, that Native people were of an inferior race or an inferior development and did not have the requisite skills to govern ourselves. Since the 1970s, there has been major reform of tribal government and law in the United States, thanks in large part to the American Indian movement and some fairly radical protest and acts that kind of called Congress and the BIA to account in these regards. And so right now, tribal nations actually have a great deal of more autonomy than we've ever had in the history of this country, let's put it that way, to govern ourselves. And so that each independent tribal nation will have its own constitution, will have its own way of electing its leaders. The leader may be called a chief, the governing council may be called a council. There may be different Native, language appropriate to that tribe. The Bureau of Indian Affairs retains an oversight of all those tribal constitutions and has to, in some ways, oversee them, not necessarily approve them, but oversee them. So there's still a custodial kind of relationship with the BIA, but there's a lot more autonomy in my generation, for sure, in tribal law. That's a great question. Go back and share this again, and we'll go through these slides, and then we'll have more Q&A. So I kind of have summarized this already, that in the United States currently, you have a lot of people living on their reservations or tribal lands. And then you also have a significant portion of the Native population in the United States living off reservation lands. But really wanting to focus on the Doctrine of Discovery as the ideology and logic, which is both theological and legal, for how we are in the situation we're in today. Obviously, when various explorers and various settler movements arrived on this continent, they discovered that they were not, in fact, discovering it, and that it was already occupied. And so then the question became, of course, how to deal with the population that is already in the land. What is to be done about this? And it's fair to say that in some unofficial ways and in some very official ways in the federal government of the United States, the thinking of the series of papal pronouncements that we call the Doctrine of Discovery really informed the approach that informed what happened in the United States, even before the United States was the United States, what happened on this continent. And that was true for explorers who were Roman Catholic or who were exploring on behalf of Roman Catholic nations. And it's, I think, fair to say that this logic, this ideology, also informed the worldview of Protestant settlers or those religious groups arriving here, some of whom are our denominational ancestors in the United Church of Christ. So at its core, there's a series of papal pronouncements, or what we call bulls, made by Pope Nicholas V. He was the Bishop of Rome, the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church, made in the late 15th century, that we lump together and we call them, kind of for convenience, the Doctrine of Discovery. And he was already at that time summarizing some theology that was really present in the Roman Catholic Church from the time of the Crusades, from the time of, contested lands with Muslim invaders, or, boundaries where Christianity was bumping up against Muslim landholding. And so he was essentially codifying a kind of logic that was already prevalent in the Roman Catholic Church, in the Holy Roman Empire. And then I think it's fair to say European Protestants inherited this way of thinking. And that way of thinking is encapsulated in the black box with this quote. This is a quote from one of the papal bulls, that when Christian explorers, crusaders, people doing conquest on behalf of the church or on behalf of Christian nations, encounter non-Christian populations, it is appropriate, it is endorsed, it is logical under this logic that there is a freedom, as you can see, to invade those lands, to capture those Saracens, which, the word for Muslims, pagans, simply meaning non-Christian persons, enemies of Christ, and replace those kingdoms with Christian rule, right? Rule on behalf of a Christian nation. So essentially what the Doctrine of Discovery is arguing is that if there is a non-Christian populace in a territory that a Christian nation or a Christian empire is a better word for it in this case, wants for itself, it is within the bounds of those groups of Christians to take that land, to conquer those people, to settle them or colonize them or exterminate them or enslave them, that those non-Christian people have no rights of their own and have no inherent title to their land. That's the logic of the Doctrine of Discovery at its kind of most crude. And how that has played out in the United States, I mean, certainly it plays out theologically. And when I stop the slides, we can talk more about that because, I think in some of our Congregationalist ancestry, ideas of manifest destiny, ideas of the Plymouth Colony and the city on a hill, kind of presume that there's a Christianizing of the land and the populace that is for the populace's own good, that is the will of God, that is the founding of the new promised land or the new Israel. There are a lot of ways in which Protestant theologies riff off of, are based on, and run with this logic and this theology. And so I think within the United Church of Christ, when we talk about repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery, we're really talking about repudiating that theology. But as we know, theologies have political consequences. And so in the United States, the political consequence of the logic of the Doctrine of Discovery is that it has informed our federal policy. And that is perhaps harder to undo and repudiate even than repudiating it theologically. So over here on the left, that we schematize Native history in the United States by period. This is something historians do. And so there's kind of a colonial period prior to Indian removal that is lumped into like from 1492 to 1828, just prior to the Federal Indian Removal Act. And as I've reviewed, the kind of logic informing this period and this period's relationship of the United States, or the founders of the United States, to Native nations was this assumption that there was a right of Christian invaders to claim the land for themselves, for the church, or for their nation back home, you know, for Spain, for England, for whomever. Even when that period ended, in essence, and the United States was formed, this logic informed the founding of the United States, and it informed federal Indian law as federal Indian law evolved. As we have said, this is a complicated situation because even though this logic was prevailing, the United States government was making treaties with Native nations, and often those treaties were under duress, they were under coercion, but they were still treaties that even today legally are seen as between one nation and another, with both nations holding certain sovereign rights. And often what would happen in those treaties is that the Native nation would cede territory or agree to removal or cede certain rights in order to hold on to at least some rights. So that there are a number of treaties, only the Congress of the United States can rescind or break a treaty. And there are, you know, multiple treaties with multiple Native nations in effect in the United States today. Most of them are not adequately honored, but they have also never been dissolved. But the Doctrine of Discovery informs American Indian law. When there is the need for new law or clarification of old law, those, you know, cases will come before a circuit court or an appellate court or even to the Supreme Court. And one of the first instances in the Supreme Court that mentioned the Doctrine of Discovery, not using those three words, but in effect, was in this case called Johnson versus McIntosh. And Johnson versus McIntosh was actually about contested title to land in the state of Illinois. And the question was, there was someone who had purchased land thinking they had purchased it from an Indian nation or an Indian individual. And the federal government was essentially asserting a right to the land and saying that only the federal government now had, at this point in history, the right or the power to sell or broker this particular piece of land to this individual that was trying to buy it. And so it was in the course of writing that decision that referred to as the Doctrine of Discovery got referenced. And I'm going to read you a little bit. This is a book called Documents of United States Indian Policy from way back when I was an undergrad. And I'm just going to read you a little bit of this decision because it illustrates the logic. Where do I even want to start? It's hard to catch. Okay. We maintain that discovery, meaning the discovery of a continent, gave an exclusive right, meaning right to the United States, to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy to the land, either by purchase or by conquest. And then going on, the power now possessed by the government of the United States to grant lands resided while we were colonies in the crown, meaning the British crown. And then the document goes on to say, this is a kind of governance over the Indian population that we have inherited from the British government and the settlers of the United States. And we're not questioning that. We're taking that as a given. We're taking that as a precedent. The British government, which was then our government, and whose rights have passed to the United States, asserted a title to all the lands occupied by Indians within the chartered limits of the British colonies. And I will add my interpretation that the British government did that because the British government's legal logic and theological logic was already informed by the Doctrine of Discovery. The title by conquest is acquired and can be maintained by force. The conqueror prescribes its limits. And so the Supreme Court of the United States arguing that the United States of America is in effect a conquering and colonizing power that can maintain its relationship with Native populations by force. Then, interestingly, the opinion goes on to say, we acknowledge that humanity often demands and a wise policy requires that the rights of the conquered have to be taken into account. So there's a certain amount of recognizing the humanity of conquered people. But then, and it says that the goal of the conquest is to blend the conquered with the conqueror, basically so that those governed as a distinct people become no longer a distinct people, but assimilate is the more modern word we'd use. But then the ruling goes on and says, but this can't be done with Native populations. The tribes of Indians inhabiting this country are fierce savages. Their occupation is war. They subsist chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country is to leave the country a wilderness. To govern them is impossible. And so the right to their land has to be relinquished. This is still the logic that undergirds United States federal Indian policy, and that's the problem. As recently as 2005, Justice Ginsburg actually wrote an opinion concurring with the logic of Johnson versus McIntosh. And the case under consideration was a dispute between a city in New York State and claims that the Oneida Nation had to certain land within those city boundaries. And so even at that time, the United States Supreme Court used as precedent this logic of the Doctrine of Discovery. Yeah, Cindy, that's exactly right. Kind of finders keepers logic. And so when we talk about repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery, I think you'll see that it's complicated. I mean, we can, as pastors, using the theological tools in our toolbox, do a lot of things that are really helpful with our people and with our denomination. We can do Bible study. We can read our historical sources to see how the logic of manifest destiny or Doctrine of Discovery may be operative, even when we don't realize it is, or even when we think we have repented of it. And those are really, really important theological steps to take, particularly, I think, for Christian denominations or Christian persons who have settler ancestry, who have colonial roots. And that's still something we have to work on in the United Church of Christ. We still have a kind of myth operative about some of this. We have churches and places named Pilgrim or Plymouth or Mayflower, and we don't really deeply examine You know, we prize some of that history, but we don't inventory that history with more of a, what we call a hermeneutic of suspicion. So we have our own work to do, right, theologically. And then we have this legal work to do. And the legal work to do, I think, is really about electing Congress people who have some openness to starting to understand federal Indian law. Certainly President Biden, in appointing Deb Haaland, the Secretary of Interior, we have made a lot of progress, although that can deeply be eroded with the next presidential administration, whoever it's going to be. But a lot of the rights of Native people in the United States today hinge on the judges in the circuit courts and the judges sitting on the Supreme Court. Interestingly enough, Justice Gorsuch just wrote the best Supreme Court decision for Native people in like centuries when he authored the opinion in McGirt versus Oklahoma. He came off the circuit court in Denver and has an expansive knowledge of tribal law and is a real advocate. So you don't always know what you're going to get with the justice, where Justice Ginsburg, I don't think meant ill will, but just worked on inherited precedent without a lot of, you know, her own understanding. So I'll stop there. I've talked for way too long. We can go a little bit longer than 4 if we want to. I don't usually fill up that much time with my own voice, but let's enter into some further conversation, and happy to answer questions.
I have a question, Stephanie.
Sure, Wayne.
The Epiphany, where I serve, has been using uses the narrative lectionary, which is and this Sunday is Joshua, who has come into the land.
Yeah.
And the Canaanites were there and they're dealing with that. And so and then the passage is, who are you going to serve? What God are you going to serve? And so I'm in the middle of, you know, obviously the week began with Indigenous Peoples Day. And I was reading a commentary today that in a joyful way said, oh, well, this is just a great conquest story. And, you know, and then, and I'm sitting there and my mind is, so I'm preparing a sermon. So I'm grateful for this opportunity today. It seems very well timed to talk about, you know, you know, because it's reflected in the stories that we lift up.
Right, it's reflected in the biblical narrative
context. So I'm putting it in the context of answering the question, you know, what God am I going to serve? And so the God of conquest and the God of empire is not a God that
is not that God.
Yeah. So even though this, and it helps that I discovered through my good friend Ken Stone, who is, you know, teaches Hebrew scriptures at CTS, that the book of Joshua was written in the exilic period. It's not written down as it happened. So it's really, when it talks about Egypt, it's really talking about Babylon. And so it
a longing for return.
Yeah. So it's
and as we know, return is complicated. I mean, whether we're talking about Israel and Palestine, whether we're talking about, you know, the exile or Moses, or you know, in the United States, among some of the most radical young Native leaders here that we've got, there's a movement called Land Back, which is essentially a desire to return a lot of land to Native hands, starting with the national parks. So, you know, don't get worried about your own house. But, you know, when we talk about what ultimately are the rights of people to land that has been settled or colonized, you inevitably then start to have to walk down the path of, well, then who is going to be displaced? so like here come the Israelites and they may think they're returning home, but the Canaanites are in the land. And how do you deal with multiple populations?
Well, and earlier we're dealing with the 24th chapter, and they talk about, well, and then it's like, well, the Canaanites, they deserve basically what they got because they
right. Same logic as in Johnson versus McIntosh.
Yeah, I mean, so
right.
the word savages isn't used, but it's heavily
implied. Yeah.
So it's so it will be an interesting sermon.
Yeah.
And I think that's the advantage of being an interim. It's like, well, you don't like it. Well, I'm just here for the search committee.
Mark also put in the chat some Mark, did you want to say anything more about what you put in the chat? And then I know Peg has her hand raised.
Well, it's, and I hope I'm not being reductive, because I'm grateful for all that you put into this, and it is a very important Doctrine of Discovery aware, but I also am thinking of, other examples sort of outside of Christianity, even outside of European history or European influenced history, where it's just an assumption that might makes right. And, that there's this entitlement that if one group is stronger than another group, they sort of, that's, survival of the fittest kind of mentality, right? And you see that in lots of places. You see that, and I think the connection from a theological standpoint is that so often across the spectrum of belief, there's sometimes an assumption or a presumption that when something happens, well, that must have been God's will, for it to have happened that way. That's sort of the theological way of saying might makes right. And I think that this is important for us that claim to be folks that think through things theologically to reflect on that. And what are the implications of that for people who are hurt by things that happen? And to say, do we really mean that? Do we really mean to imply that, to put it down to a very small level, bullying makes itself okay? And I think when you think about it that way, well, obviously not. But there's so many ways that we sort of just, I've heard it from liberals and conservatives, well, it must be God's will or whatever, just because something happens. And I think that's important to sort of theologically critique that, to say, is that really the will of God?
Right.
Or is that just, are we just rationalizing the way
history happened?
Yes, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Good point. Thank you, Mark. Peg.
Yeah, it's just a comment. Really, I've been thinking about this for the past few days, that we're in such a quagmire because here we have, the indigenous people here, and then we're talking about the African Americans that we brought over and enslaved them and making reparations there. And it's like, almost like saying, well, maybe we can give you all this, and it's stuff that we took from the Native Americans to begin with, and it's like this just horrible mock of mess that we've done. And this whole presentation has been horribly fascinating. But
I mean, it is a rabbit hole. I want to speak to Pastor Jen. I think this is over in the chat, who's mentioning essentially the practice of land acknowledgement, where a community or a church or somebody will acknowledge the traditional or tribal land that the institution or community sits on. And this is becoming a prevalent practice. I actually have an article about this in the Christian Century, which went live virtually this very week, if you want to look it up, because there are better and worse ways to do land acknowledgement. But I think your point is, like, how do you even determine whose tribal land you're acknowledging? Because in certain places you have migration or you have war between tribal nations. And so most land acknowledgement is acknowledging the tribal nations that were treated either with the federal government of the United States or the British or Mexican or whoever colonized. But so you're acknowledging the land that was held by the nation that has a treaty and was subsequently removed or had some erosion of territory. So that's usually the way contemporary land acknowledgements work. And back of that, we know at a certain level that other tribal nations may have been in those lands before, but what we're recognizing is that treated relationship or that removal, that the land acknowledgement is acknowledging the role of the United States government in the fact that those tribal nations don't have all their tribal homeland today.
It was, I think what was uncomfortable for me was the use of the term in perpetuity, which, as you explain that, I'm sure comes from the treaty language.
Yeah.
But one doesn't have to go very far back at all to when Minnesota was Lakota land. It's not hard to.
Not all of Minnesota was Lakota land.
A lot of Minnesota was. Yeah. And of course their whole story of being removed from the land as well when the Anishinaabe weren't. But just I think that's what had struck me was the in perpetuity. And it helps to have you frame it in the language of the treaty that's standing.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, I think that's usually what it's attempting to refer to. Like you do the research. So like Pastor Jackie is saying that Leek Street Church, which is an American Baptist church in Evanston, and I live in Evanston, has been doing this land acknowledgement. And so the probably likely nations they're acknowledging are the 3 treated nations in this area, which were the Potawatomi, the Ottawa, and one of the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe bands. Those are the treated people that were removed to clear the way for the settlement of Evanston. Well, thank you. I want to appreciate that we're 5 minutes over the hour. I really want to thank you for being with me. And, we've just touched the tip of the iceberg, but please go to those Doctrine of Discovery study materials. They speak to a lot of the theological issues that Mark and Wayne were raising that really do hit home for us in our preaching, in our pulpit, in our Bible study. In how we speak about the founding of the United Church of Christ. So, do make use of those materials in your own ministry. And if you have any question about land acknowledgements or about other stuff, like how to be in ministry with Native communities today, I've got some better and worse examples of how to do that. And I'm glad to be in conversation with any of you. So, next week, we are not meeting because we have our annual celebration and we really want to encourage all of you in your churches to register. And then the following week, the last Wednesday of the month is always just a check-in with conference staff. I'll be on vacation. I'll actually be in Oklahoma that week. So someone else will be leading that, but Molly or someone will just be kind of probably doing an annual celebration budget overview of like the business of the annual celebration. So thank you very much for your time. Go in peace and give good witness. God bless you.
Thank you.
You are welcome. You are very welcome.